before I start. So the reason I wanted to talk about depression is because it is so common. It's one of the most common, I would say, medical conditions that humanity faces. So let's see, how many people are here approximately?
About 10.
About 16, 17 people, right? So it is this common that if there are, like say if there were 20 people here, then out of that 10%, which would be at least 2 people, are going to at some point face severe depressive symptoms in their life, to the point that it should require treatment. It doesn't happen, unfortunately, but that's how common it is. So if you have a room full of 100 people, 30% of them, that means 30 out of 100 people, will experience depressive symptoms at least at some point in their life. And 10 people out of those 100 will have severe depressive symptoms at some stage in their life. So it's a very, if you can take away one thing from this, it is that it's a very common condition. And we psychiatrists, we cannot even treat everyone. So a lot of people will be dealing with their primary care physicians as the primary source for treatment. So what I'm trying to say is that most of the people with depression don't even end up seeing psychiatrists. It is that common, and the need is there so much. So I just wanted to use this opportunity to talk about the myths we have about depression and the misconceptions we have, and just to give you some idea about what depression is, how can you deal with it, and what can be your role as a member of the community. If you see someone in your family, if you see a friend, what can you do, practical steps in terms of how do you deal with this. So first of all, before we start, without looking here, can somebody tell me what they think depression is? What does it mean to be depressed?
Someone who's sad all the time.
Okay, for how long? Because we have very clear criteria for diagnosing somebody. So yes, that's correct.
At least a month.
A month, okay. Any other ideas about it? Go ahead.
I think it's a sense of hopelessness, a sense of loss,
Yes.
a sense of loss of direction, something where you don't have any interest anymore and you can't even explain why.
Sure. So this is the DSM criteria for depression, which is our diagnostic. Yes, ma'am.
Does mood disorder come into it too?
So mood disorder is more non-specific. Sometimes when we cannot figure it out, we say mood disorder unspecified, which is a very vague diagnosis, because people with bipolar disorder can also have depression, and it can present similarly, but the treatment has to be very different. And I can talk some more about it later on if you want. So the criteria for depression is persistent symptoms for at least 2 weeks. That's our criteria. And you're right, low mood. So it has to be either low mood or loss of pleasure in anything, which we call anhedonia, like a person cannot take pleasure in anything at all. So either one of these, and then 5 of these criteria. So the real goal of the presentation is you have to memorize all of this. I'm just kidding. No, you don't have to. Even I cannot. So a nice mnemonic for that would be SIGI CAPS. So number 1 would be sleep disturbances, which for most people would be less sleep. Very rarely it would mean sleeping more than usual. So whatever the baseline is, there's a change from that. Then interest. There would be, you mentioned that, loss of interest. You're not interested in anything anymore. There can be marked guilt about things, feeling guilty about how they are functioning, and guilt about a lot of things. So that can be a predominant symptom. And then energy, there's low energy. Just people say that, they even with severe depression, people find it very difficult to even get out of bed, and you do things like even taking a shower can become a task. So that happens. Loss of concentration. So students will tell you they just sit there for hours and they cannot concentrate on anything anymore. Like, everything feels blurry. Changes in appetite. Usually there's weight loss. but sometimes there can be weight gain as well. So there's a marked change from the baseline. What we call psychomotor retardation, which means that just you will see people moving very slowly. And very rarely in kids, usually there can be psychomotor agitation, like they're more irritable, they can be more hyper. And what else? And then suicidal thoughts. And I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about suicidal thoughts because we need to know what the difference between passive thoughts and active thoughts, and so we'll talk more about that. So low mood, loss of pleasure, either of these two, and then 5 of these, the symptoms that I just mentioned. That is what, and that's what the clinical criteria is for somebody to be depressed. Okay, so I just wanted to put it up there, like there are a lot of these here, like distress, dysfunction, defeat, distance, disregard. But the most important out of all of these here is the dysfunction. That is what we focus on. Like, if it's a mother, like, she may tell you, like, I find it very hard to cook for my kids anymore, I cannot do my chores anymore. If it's a student, like, just that, it affects your performance. WHO recognizes this, and billions of dollars are lost every year in productivity because of depression. So it's a very serious thing. I do want to start by talking about the causes, like what causes depression. Does anyone have any ideas, like what can be the root cause for it?
Like
Go ahead.
sudden changes in life, like death, divorce.
Okay, yes. So
Tragedy.
stressors, okay,
Tragedy.
yes.
Illness and health issues.
That's a good point, yes. Health issues, like, if somebody has a heart attack, if somebody has a cancer diagnosis, that can increase your chances of becoming depressed. What else?
Do drugs also affect it?
Yes, definitely so. But I do want to mention something about drugs. I think it's a misconception that people usually use drugs to get a high. Most of the people are trying to, I would say it's a maladaptive way of trying to treat pain, emotional pain. We'll take a break. Where were we? So we were talking about drugs. So it's a maladaptive way of trying to treat emotional pain. And there in fact are separate diagnoses for that: alcohol-induced depressive disorder, substance-induced depressive disorder. And it can be very difficult to tease out which came first. But now we are becoming more aggressive in treating that with antidepressants too. Before the thinking used to be, okay, let's only treat that, but now the thinking is, there is usually underlying depression there too, so let's try to treat that. So what I want to emphasize here is, if you take nothing away from this slide, is that there are multiple causes. Just like if somebody has high cholesterol, there is usually family history, and then the eating habits, lack of exercise. So this can also be multifactorial. For most of the people, it doesn't just happen. Yes, life stresses, yes, that can be a trigger, but usually there's more to it. There can be hormonal deficiencies, there can be vitamin deficiencies. People can have genetic predisposition for depression. Same thing for anxiety, even for PTSD, like, it can be, because even if you think about genetics, it's a two-way street. There are more studies being done for epigenetics. Like, it's not like something set in stone. We modify our genes because of our lifestyles, because of what happens, and then we pass it on. So most of the people, when they think about depression, is like they think, oh, life stress. But I just want to emphasize that there are a lot of other causes for it too. Okay, so how can you tell as a person whether you yourself, you're depressed to the point that you need help, or if it's a child in your family, or a friend, or a family member? So what you may frequently see is frequent crying spells, like somebody who just is very tearful for even small things, like even if they're watching a movie, like and it's different from their baseline. There's a marked difference, like everything makes them cry, so crying more often. This is very important: unexplained physical symptoms, especially in conservative communities and cultures. there can be somatic manifestation of psychiatric symptoms, and there's a reason for it. It's not that that person is faking it, it's just that that is the socially acceptable way for them to express their pain. So, like, say if somebody is in a village and if a woman tells her family, you know, I don't feel like doing this work anymore, I'm feeling very depressed, that will not be acceptable. If she says, I have backache and I have a headache and nothing is helping, then everybody will be nice to her, and, you know, this can happen. So this, especially and I think in our community, that can happen even more often, because that's the language that everybody understands when somebody talks about physical symptoms. There can be speech latency. So if somebody is like, you know, you're talking to them and they take a long time to respond and they're talking very slowly, or they're talking in a low volume, so there's a difference there. So, you know, there can be physical cues to how they are feeling. It just changes how they can react to the world around them. When does it become very serious? When do you really need to have an immediate intervention, even if somebody doesn't express having suicidal thoughts? So that would be things like writing goodbye letters, and even suddenly giving away all their belongings and their favorite things, and they're just like handing everything out. So there's a marked difference there. And that would be a time to intervene, even if somebody's not open about openly talking about how they're feeling. I want to spend a lot of time talking about this. The difference between what is active suicidal ideation versus passive suicidal ideation. So suicidal ideation is thoughts about wanting to kill yourself, right? What do you think is the difference? I mean, what comes to mind?
So in active suicidal ideation, the patient will have a plan. They will have, you know, something to actually kill themselves, a gun or access to these kind of weapons. But passive suicidal ideation is that, you know, just those defeating thoughts come in the mind and you feel like you are just worthless. It's not, you know, life is not worth living, but you don't have actual a plan to go with.
Excellent. So you know it already. So passive suicidal thoughts are when somebody says things like, I wish I would wake up and be dead. I don't want to be here anymore. I don't want to be in this world anymore. So that's having passive thoughts. Yes, that needs treatment, but it is relatively, in the scheme of things, less urgent than active suicidal thoughts. And even for active suicidal thoughts, there's, you know, if somebody has a plan, but it's a vague plan, versus somebody who has a very clear plan, like, I have this gun and this is what I'm thinking about using, that's more serious. And then also like, okay, in this particular day, this happened, so I cannot handle, like, on this day, I'll do this. That is something very serious. And also the intention. Okay, fine, they are having the active thoughts. Do they have the intention of doing it? Finding out what are the risk factors, what are the protective factors. Again, that would be not your job, but I'm just trying to give an idea about when I do an assessment, what kind of things I look at. Protective factors like, you know, some people have strong religious beliefs and they're like, there's just no way we will do it. That is protective up to a certain extent. Okay, so if somebody's having passive thoughts and they're saying we have religious beliefs against it, we care about our kids, all of that, I may be a little bit less worried and say, okay, fine, outpatient treatment versus somebody who does have those protective factors but still is having the plan and intent, and then may have a lot of guilt about it, but that's what they're facing. Again, this is very important. If you ask somebody about suicidal thoughts, if you're worried about that, even as a member of the community, even for a family member, do not hesitate to ask them. You don't have to wait for them to be seen by a physician. You can just flat out ask them, are you, in a nice supportive way, not like in front of 30 people or whatever. So you can just be very supportive and just ask them straight away, what's going on? How serious is this? Are you having thoughts to kill yourself? I'm worried about you. Asking about it does not make it worse. A lot of people have this assumption that if they ask about it, they're going to somehow induce it in the other person. That research has shown that does not happen. So, and I feel like it can be our duty to ask about it, right? We just, usually people tend to just brush it under the rug. It's like, you know, I don't want to deal with it, I don't want to hear it, but that doesn't make it go away. Any questions about this? Okay, so another thing I wanted to talk about is, so when I do a suicidal risk assessment, and I try to do a good job about documenting that too. So what I look at is this a vulnerable period for them? What kind of support they have? Our past dictates our present and our future, right? So I'm very interested in the past history. Like in the past, have they ever tried to hurt themselves? How serious was it? What happened? Did they ask for help themselves? Or did somebody else have to intervene? So these are clues for me to indicate what I need to do for them at this time.
I have a question.
Yes.
So, if one of your family member, you think that he has this kind of issue, then how can we help? Like, what are the steps we can take? Because when the kids become adult, then their treatment is on them. Like,
Right.
you cannot ask the appointment, even go for taking an appointment. They says no, we need to be that.
We are
person
going
needs
to talk
be-
about that, yes, and excellent point, because that's what we need to know.
Okay.
I just wanted to briefly talk about, since you guys had mentioned life stressors, the difference between grief and depression, because there can be a death in the family. How do you tease out whether this person is suffering from depression versus this is grief? And so usually the duration for grief can be up to 2 months, although I personally think it can be much longer, and even that can be normal grief. There can be morbid feelings of loss about the death. But if somebody starts saying that I'm so distressed that I want to join this person, like I cannot live without this person, I'm having thoughts of joining this person, they may be trying to tell you they're having suicidal thoughts. That's something different. In normal grief, people can even have illusion. So illusion is like, if I say I'm seeing a snake, there's no snake there, so that's an illusion. So, with close relationships, even illusions can be a normal part of grief. They feel like they're seeing that person or they're hearing that person. Even that can be a normal part of grief. So what we look at is the level of dysfunction, whether they're having suicidal thoughts. This can be difficult to tease out, but I just wanted to mention it briefly.
So
Go ahead.
So in grief, you said the duration is 2 months.
It can be up to 2 months.
Can be up to 2 months.
Clinically, that's what it is.
So the depression definition
weeks.
is 2 weeks.
Mhm.
So then if a person is going through a grief after the
Mhm.
death of a loved one for 2 months or more, then should we say that they are depressed, or?
No, that's what I'm trying to say. You should not say they're depressed. What I would look at is the level of dysfunction. Like if they're not sleeping at all,
okay,
they're
so all
not
those symptoms.
showering at all, and they're making statements like, I want to join this person, or like, life is totally bleak, then I would still go ahead and start treatment.
Oh.
And there's something called prolonged grief reaction too. So even grief is not just like, this one kind of grief, but
Oh.
it can be difficult to tease out. But again, when I showed you the slide about dysfunction, we look at what is the level of dysfunction here.
So is there a length period for depression too?
So depression basically can last for months, one episode. We need minimum of at least 2 weeks of symptoms to clinically say, okay, this is depression. So it may be depression even before 2 weeks, but that's what we look at, because there are other diagnoses out there like adjustment disorder with depressed mood, adjustment disorder with depressed and anxious mood. So there are a lot of diagnoses out there. But clinically, that's what we need before we diagnose that. Moving on about treatment options. I wanted to show you this slide just to talk a little bit about psychotherapy. And I'm a huge fan of psychotherapy. So a lot of people, when they think about depression, they think that the feelings are just automatic, that they come out of nowhere. And that of course affects the behavior and then the thoughts. It's a two-way street. Everything is interlinked. So we have our core beliefs, and that affects how we perceive others, and what the future holds. And when people are depressed, it's almost like they have their blinders up, like nothing seems to be working, nobody seems to be helping, so they can be in that mind frame. And this is what psychotherapy does, especially cognitive behavior therapy. It teaches you that your feelings are not necessarily automatic, that your thoughts are leading to those feelings which are leading to that behavior. A simple example would be like if you have a friend coming over for coffee and your house is a mess, you're not feeling up to cleaning, but you will still get up, you will still clean it, you will still make that coffee, right? Even if you don't feel like it, you're putting in that effort. So this is what psychotherapy can encourage you to do and break that pattern, which can be very difficult. But again, people have this misconception about therapy or medication. A lot of people ask me like, should I do therapy or medication? And my question to them is, why not both? The fact that you're here is a serious situation, like why not try everything? They don't go against each other, they go hand in hand. Just like if somebody is diabetic, yes, they need medication at that point, but they also need the lifestyle changes. They also need to work on maybe their spirituality to improve their lifestyle. Why not do everything? But unfortunately, when it comes to mental health disorders, people tend to think in very black and white terms, like either this or that, and you can do a combination of things. There's nothing that, that you should do only psychotherapy and not medication. There's nothing like that. You can do a combination of it. Unfortunately, a lot of people self-medicate. We talked briefly about drugs and alcohol, but even before that, people tend to talk a lot about herbs, and unfortunately, a lot of people these days are trying to use cannabis for self-medication. So the problem with all of that is we don't know what you're taking and how much. So it's very dangerous. First of all, so this self-medication that usually I see that there are, it doesn't end well, let's put it this way, just in simple terms, it usually doesn't end well. Because with medication, we know what you're getting, what dose you're getting, and it's more traceable. With these different herbs and spices out there, we have no clue what's in it and what people are taking. Any questions about that?
So you said medications, are you gonna elaborate it or further, or?
Yes.
Also, I'd like to add that the herbs and spices are not FDA approved.
Exactly.
So anybody can just put anything up.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, these medications, there's a lot of research there, FDA approves it, we know the doses, there's a process to it. Did you have any particular questions
Yeah,
about
I mean, what I
medications
mean
that I
to
can
say was
address?
that, so is it like, what is biochemically inside the brain happens that these medications are gonna like,
Work?
yeah, I mean, they say these transmitters and all that, but is this really like, evidence based, or, because
Yes.
they have a lot of side effects too. So
Right.
do they, because,
So I just want to mention one thing about antidepressants. There are different classes for it. The most commonly known ones that you may have heard about are SSRIs, which are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, because I think you were referring to the deficiency of serotonin in
Yeah.
the neurotransmitters.
right,
So this is what and you probably, everybody has heard the name Prozac. That's like, it's been around
Yeah.
forever now. And Celexa, Zoloft. So these drugs belong to this class, and then there's selective serotonin norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors, which works on 2 receptors, and then there are some other classes too. Yes, the medications work, and most of the antidepressants have minimal side effects. If I have to choose like what kind of treatment I need to put somebody on, I would feel very comfortable with antidepressants overall. Yes, there are side effects, but they're not as bad as the mood stabilizers can have more side effects. Some of the antipsychotics can have more side effects. So side effect profile wise, antidepressants overall are a much safer class to use. They used to use what we call TCAs, tricyclic antidepressants, back in the 50s and 60s. They had serious side effects, and when taken in an overdose could be lethal. So overall, this class of medication is safe. And I also want to mention, why don't we talk about it here while we are on it? There are other conditions that can be treated by it. You guys may have heard about obsessive compulsive disorder. There can be impulse control disorders. Even things like, even after somebody has a heart attack, even if they don't appear to be depressed, they can still benefit. It can affect the platelet counts in a good way to make the platelets less sticky. So there are other uses to IBS. Independently, they can make the symptoms better. So there are other uses for antidepressants as well. And they're the first line of treatment for anxiety disorders as well. PTSD. I do want to mention one thing about PTSD and anxiety disorders. Benzodiazepines usually don't work. That's what research has shown, long term. So the long-term treatment would be antidepressants.
Antidepressants. So the somnolence is not their big side effect?
For most of them, no. For some of them, yes. And then we try to give it at night. Sometimes we try to use their side effect, like somebody is having trouble sleeping, loss of appetite. We try to give them the antidepressant, which may make them more
So
sleepy.
with the antidepressants, person can still function. It's not that
That's the whole goal.
It's the, I think, the misconception.
Yeah,
that,
misconception
you
is that,
take it
yeah.
and then you sleep.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
I think.
Yes, ma'am.
The misconception you're talking about, that actually I had a friend of mine who used to, doctor had prescribed her this depression medicine. So the tendency was that, you take these medicines, you sort of get addicted to it because they get sedative or something like
No.
that.
Wow.
So, the condition of theirs is, they keep them in that state for quite some time. So they really don't come out of it.
So here's the thing. Benzodiazepines, yes, addictive, which would be Xanax, which is alprazolam, Ativan, which is lorazepam, yes, can be very addictive. Think of them as steroids, good for you in the short term, not good for you in the long term. None of the antidepressants that are out there are addictive.
Oh.
Another thing is, general rule of the thumb is, if somebody has one depressive episode, they need treatment for severe depression 6 to 9 months at least. 2 depressive episodes, at least 2 years. 3 or more episodes is recommended, be on it lifelong. And that's what I think what you were talking about, people struggle with that. But then again, most of the diseases we have out there, just like high blood pressure, diabetes, we live with it, don't we? Like 80% of the diseases we have, these are chronic diseases that we just have to. So think about that as maintenance. So if one medication is maintaining you, making you functional for your life, unfortunately what happens is people start feeling better and they're like, oh, I'm better, and then they stop it and then they relapse. But every time that happens, they may become more treatment resistant. And especially, we're not talking about bipolar disorder today, but that happens even more frequently in bipolar disorder. People stop their medications, they're better, and then things get worse.
I also have a question. If you can elaborate whenever you get a chance for PTSD, because there are a lot of people who don't know what PTSD is.
Oh, okay, good point. Sorry, because I do this every day, so I tend to forget.
Split my mind. Never mind.
That's okay. So PTSD, very briefly, is post-traumatic stress disorder. And that is the one disorder in psychiatry in which we need a traumatic event, like something happens and then this thing happens. So PTSD is a result of that traumatic event, which may be indirectly experienced. So, the rates can be higher in war zones, people, victims of sexual assault, and it's an anxiety disorder. And most of the people can slowly recover on their own, but some people cannot, depending on different factors. So that's what PTSD is, just in a nutshell. Okay, so how can you help? And that comes, I think you were talking about what do you do if your kid is not listening to you and you think they need help. So there are a couple of ways to go about it. So first of all, being supportive. If you think somebody needs help, just making sure they know about the resources. It's always better if the initiative comes from that person. Usually if the spouse sends them or if the mom sends them, it usually doesn't work that well. So, just helping that person gently, making them realize that, okay, you need help. However, if something is really serious, if it's an acute safety concern, like if somebody, say, has a weapon, has been making suicidal comments, then what you can do is call 911 and just tell them what the situation is. The police comes and does a welfare check, and then they can be at least taken to the ER. And again, that's not the recommended thing because there can be a lot of bad feelings about it if that person doesn't want to go. However, sometimes it's necessary. And then when they are seen at the ER, then the psychiatrist can make a decision whether they meet the criteria for emergency hold or not. Now the criteria, especially in Texas, is pretty high. So it has to be, you have to show that there's a clear and present danger. So they are either a danger to themselves, to anybody else, or grave disability. So that paperwork gets filed and a judge has to sign it. The initial stays in most states is 48 hours. They can be kept for 48 hours, but they're seen every day, and then the decision is made whether the hold needs to be prolonged or not. So this is what happens when something is very serious and that person is refusing to seek help. But otherwise, just so I think that goes along with what I want to talk about, what level of help is required. And unfortunately, that's what a family member usually has to sort of decide on their own, okay, I need to do this at this point. I would say always err on the side of caution. Like if you have serious concerns about someone, just go ahead and do it. Because suicide is a psychiatric emergency, right? So I would say in some cases it cannot be prevented, just like in some cases with severe diabetes or whatever, nothing works. But in most of the cases, it's something preventable. It's a crisis in that particular moment. So if you can tide them over, keep them safe in that moment, then there are a lot of chances that they may get better. Okay, so I just wanted to put it up there that what is a myth and what is a fact. Just so, if you take nothing else away from the presentation, if you can just, this slide and the next one. So most of the people unfortunately think that depression is not a real illness. It is. It is actually recognized by WHO, and it is a mental health condition. So it's the most common mental health condition. Antidepressants cure depression? No, they manage depression. If you have pneumonia, the antibiotics, yes, that's curing the pneumonia, but what we are doing with antidepressants is managing it. And the treatment has to be very specific. There are a lot of antidepressants out there. Unfortunately, even some prime care physicians don't really know how to titrate the dose. So most of the people either are not medicated, or if they're medicated, they're under-medicated. So, because they're usually starting dose, and then the dose needs to be titrated up, and then people are like, say, on a very low dose, 10 milligrams of Prozac, and they're like, I'm not getting better. It can take up to 2 months to get a little bit better. It takes time, and most of people either give up or they just stay on that low dose, and so they're undertreated. So unfortunately that's what happens most of the time. There are algorithms for that, how we treat it. Like, okay, one doesn't work, let's try this class, and then sometimes even a combination. And then again, people think that anxiety is just negative thinking. No, it's not. People can have genetic predispositions, and there can be a lot of physical manifestations of anxiety too. So usually a lot of times people come to the ER and they get the EKG, they get everything, but once everything is clear, that's where our role comes in. Okay, fine, there doesn't seem to be a medical cause for this presentation, what else can we do?
So it could be a panic attack.
Yes, because a lot of people actually feel like they're about to die.
Exactly.
This is how a panic attack feels like, because they hyperventilate so much. And I'm sorry for going all academic on you, but it's very interesting when people hyperventilate. There's in our body, there's ionized calcium, so basically too much carbon dioxide goes out, and they can have cramping and a lot of pain because of that. And that's why sometimes for them, if they just breathe in a paper bag just so they keep their carbon dioxide inside, that's the whole thing. So they don't get that cramping, and it gets better. So another myth is that people think it's obvious when somebody is depressed. It sometimes may not be obvious, especially if somebody is very committed to their work. They may still be performing well at work, because they're just doing it, but that doesn't mean. So you really have to know, and I think that's where the role of communication comes in. Communication with our friends, with our family members, just knowing what the other person is going through, to not have that disconnect. Especially in this digital age, I mean, I see a lot of kids, even at lunches and dinners, like the kids are on their phones and the parents are on their phone, and it's like there's no communication there. So we need to make sure there's more communication in the family, so we actually know what's going on in the family. Okay, so again, a myth that depression only happens when bad things happen in your life. That can be a trigger. Usually it's the triggers, usually it's not the cause. And it can happen anytime. And I would say that overall mental health disorders, and especially depression, very democratic diseases in a way that it happens in every community. You can have any religious affiliation. Yes, your religious beliefs may be protected for you, so to help you deal with it. And this is what a lot of people have guilt about. Like, you know, I should not be feeling this way. I have these protective beliefs. And I tell them that, you know, you're human. Your beliefs are helping you deal with it. That doesn't prevent it. Like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't give us this affidavit, okay, fine, if you believe this, then you'll be fine. Like, you know, just like with other diseases, it happens. So most of the time, people are too hard on themselves about it. And then again, a myth that depression is something you can snap out of. With some things like adjustment disorder, when the stressor goes away, yes, that can improve, but usually not for depression. Just like with other diseases, it needs to be treated. And then another myth that only suicidal people need medication. It doesn't have to get that bad. Treatment can begin even before that. So, but unfortunately, because, you know, that can be that sliding door that, you know, people slide that far, and then it's difficult to treat them, and then you know, because when somebody's, you have to remember, when somebody's that depressed, it's very difficult for them to be their own advocate and say, okay, I need this, and this. Because they're having low self-esteem at that point, they feel like they're a burden on society and on their family, so it can be very difficult. So they need a lot of support, that's what I'm trying to say.
I have a question
Yes.
about the tweens. What I have noticed that there is some kind of predisposing factor for teens to get depressed, because I have seen when I was teen that I have seen that we have a depressive, like a thoughts comes to you. And I have seen that most of the teenagers in early 20s, they have this worries and fears in them, and it leads to depression. Is it the case, I mean, for teens? Or
I think what you're trying to ask is it worse now as compared to when
yeah,
we were kids? Is that what you're asking?
yeah, not exactly. I'm just thinking what my observation is, that there is some kind of link that sometimes this teenage years and early 20s you feel depressed for some reason. There is a hormonal
Teenage
interest.
years and early 20s are hard anyway, so a lot of hormonal changes. You know, academically you have to perform so much. You know, you have to prepare yourself for life. So yes, those stresses are there. However, like during the pandemic, what I'm seeing these days is I'm seeing a lot of teens after suicidal attempts. I'm seeing a lot of 65 plus people too who are coming from nursing homes. So, you know, we tend to forget about that group. In fact, the suicide rate is going up in that group. Like you would think somebody over 65 is usually well settled and very, you know, so it's not just the teens and people in their early 20s. I do want to briefly talk about what Islam says about seeking treatment, because I think that's important. And our Prophet ﷺ, if you look at his life, he had so many losses. He dealt with all of them so gracefully. So and he's such a good role model for what can you do for having a healthy lifestyle, right? Starting from oral hygiene to, like, you know, regular sleep patterns, like making sure you get enough sleep. Like Islam has so much focus on go to bed early, do this, do that. So life seems very regimented that way, but there's a reason behind it. Like there's so much focus on healthy living. Even our Prophet encouraged us to for exercise, and you know, because exercise can help a lot with depression, in addition for having physical benefits. I do want to talk about this one hadith. So this is narrated by Abu Huraira. So our Prophet said that, make use of medical treatment, for Allah has not made a disease without appointing a remedy for it, with the exception of one disease, namely old age. So I just want to emphasize that there's no clash here. Our religion does not tell us that we should not seek treatment. In fact, our religion encourages us to use whatever resources we have at our disposal. So I just wanted to emphasize that, because unfortunately, for some reason, a lot of people in their mind think that there's some sort of conflict there, and you've seen that too, especially when it comes to mental health disorders. Just accepting that and seeking treatment. Yes.
Yeah, I heard one word that kind of triggered me. I was like, wait, So is old age a disease?
No.
Okay, because you had mentioned,
I'm just quoting the hadith, and of course, when it's a hadith, I cannot leave something out or
yeah,
add
so
something, right? So,
except death maybe instead of saying old age, maybe except for death, because there's no cure for death except for,
like I said, this is how it was on the website,
okay.
and so I wouldn't change it myself. If you think that the hadith is different, then definitely.
But it says age on the hadith?
Yeah,
Like I
yeah.
said, it does.
Yeah, we
Okay,
have.
okay, that's what I'm
So
asking.
sister, old age can cause what? Decrease energy, fatigue,
But I
right?
don't think it's
They
really
have
a
arthritis,
disease, but
they have
it's-
this and
it's-
that.
But
So
it
it's-
is.
I mean,
So
we
it's
were heading
irreversible.
towards death, let's put it this way.
That's it, yeah, okay, yes.
You know,
They're all
the
included.
this is
irreversible
kind of
changes.
like a human default mechanism inside is that with age you are going towards your death.
Yeah.
So this is the progression.
You lost your ability.
I mean, the way I think about this hadith is it's such an optimistic hadith.
Mhm.
I mean,
Yeah.
it's beautiful.
Mhm.
It's just that that human resilience, our quest to seek the best possible solution to problems. I wanted to have a lot of time for questions because I just don't want this to be a lecture. So if anybody has, please feel free to ask any questions, and I'm here for you.
So would you enlighten us with coping strategies in terms of like practically if there's a family member or yourself going through this, what are the practical strategies we can do? What are the actual CBT techniques or any resources online or?
Sure. So that will take a couple of hours if we start talking about it. But can you guys pass this on? I'll just, in fact, leave one for me so I can take a look at this too. So that if you, once you pass it on, I just want to give you an idea about when I see somebody in the ER and they are at even if it's just passive SI or if it's just suicidal gestures, would be like doing it in front of somebody or just cutting for stress relief. I try to talk about all of this with them before I let them go, even if my plan is okay, they're cleared from my side. So I'll just wait for everybody to get it and then we can start talking about it. In the meanwhile, does somebody have any other question?
I remember what I was gonna say. You know how we said that medication is not addictive for depression? But then when you go to doctors, they always say they wanna wean you off of a medicine. So that kinda gives you the concept that it might be addictive, A lot of times,
That's a very good
important
point.
question
So
that they
that's a
say.
very good point. So again, there are different medications like Prozac has a very long half-life, about 1 week. That does not need to be weaned off. An antidepressant like Paxil has a very short half-life. That means it stays in your body for a very short duration of time. So for that, to avoid some unpleasant side effects, like there are particular antidepressants more so than others that need to be weaned off. So something like Paxil, something like Effexor should be tapered off slowly. That does not mean that they are addictive. They're just that to prevent certain side effects. When you use the word addictive, that would be like you are becoming dysfunctional in the sense that you cannot live without it. Even when there's no need for it, you're using it. So avoiding side effects versus addiction, they're very different things.
My mother was depressed,
Mhm.
okay, like very bad, but, I think that what this sister in red is maybe trying to say is the person who is depressed, they feel like they can't snap out of it and they are dependent on it. And like my mother, when she would come off of depression, and as soon as she was not taking any more medication, her whole personality, everything changed again, and then she had to have it again. And it's not that it's addictive, it's that some people do need it as a dependent.
But again, my question about that is, if they need it, it's just one medication once a day that is helping them stay functional.
Yeah.
And the consequences, I mean, the other side of that is that they may even start to have suicidal thoughts. What's the harm in taking it? If somebody has high blood pressure and exercise and lifestyle changes is not working and they have to take that pill every day, otherwise their blood pressure can go up and they can have a stroke. So it's very protective. So any minor side effect that they even may experience it's still worth it, right? Everything
Worth
is a
it,
risk
yes.
benefit ratio. So
Yes,
what is the
it's
risk
worth it.
benefit
It's
ratio
worth it.
for them?
Yeah.
And the other thing is that with the newer antidepressants coming out, I mean, it's so much better. Things are so much better in terms of the research out there, the number of treatment options out there. It's just amazing how much work is being done.
I have a question. What are some identifying factors of having anxiety? Because growing up, my mom would say things like in Urdu, like "Mera dil ghebra raha hai," and I never understood what that meant until I got older, and now I realize she's probably anxious. So what are some identifying, "Mera dil ghebra raha," for those of you who don't speak Urdu, means like my heart is, I don't know how to
No,
translate
yeah, I
it.
speak Urdu.
Yeah, no, but if there's anyone here that does it.
Okay.
I
Yeah, I'm
meant-
sorry if anybody wants me to talk in Urdu, I can
Yeah.
do that later on this week.
But my mom would always say that, and I never understood, and now I realized she was probably anxious. So what, I feel like our culture tends to negate those feelings because it's like, well, what are you anxious about? What's the point? Or like if someone's depressed, it's like jinn yeah, like there
Right.
might be a jinn, or like someone put nazar, and like.
Especially when, like, say if somebody's from upper middle class or higher class, it's like, तुम्हें क्या हुआ? तुम्हारे पास तो पैसे इतने हैं, तुम्हारे बच्चे हैं, तुम्हारा मियाँ है. So again, there's sort of like that, almost like a blame thing. But that's what the thing is. It can happen to anyone. There can be a lot of factors. That doesn't mean having this seemingly beautiful life may not be protective. I mean, life is hard, right? So,
Yeah.
and just like with other diseases, just like it doesn't protect us from having other diseases, like, I mean, I don't know, give an example.
Basing often, brush it off as
Yeah,
well.
that's-
Yes,
It's
exactly.
not bad,
And very dismissive about it.
Or they say it's nazar.
And then there
or
is a
it's
denial in the family about these things, that they don't want to address it, they don't want to even
There's
accept it
a lot
that
of
this is.
stigma about it. People don't talk about it.
Yeah.
They try to hide it. And just like even I only saw this in Pakistan. It was just amazing. Like, they would like jinn aa gaya, ye ho gaya. Because that's again, a jinn aana is more acceptable than saying that somebody's depressed. Like,
I need to ask something.
yes.
I know we always talk about women, depression and all this. What about with men?
So
How do we handle
They're the
that?
cause of it.
exactly. So I'll tell you something interesting.
How do we handle that?
So again, being supportive, emphasizing women, you're right. Women are better about accepting symptoms. Overall, that's been my experience, especially in Desi communities. I'll tell you something interesting. So women attempt suicide 4 times more than men in US, but men die 4 times higher than women just because of. And there's a reason for it, because the method of suicide also becomes important. Like women tend to take overdoses, we can do something about it. Men tend to use more guns, so that's a more lethal method. That's why I talk a lot about gun safety with everyone, especially in Texas. So the method of suicide can become very important too. So if you're looking at the rate of depression, yes, a lot of men are depressed too, and it may be harder to treat them, especially in the Desi community. So again, just being supportive and just seeing what level of intervention is required.
I think, like you said, it's the ego. I don't even think, I don't know if it's necessarily as much
Cultural
as it's the ego
expectations.
as it is cultural expectations.
Yes.
Like I feel like a lot of men that I've seen that I suspect to be depressed, and I'm not a doctor, they manifest their depression with anger as opposed to
Because that's culturally more acceptable.
than crying or
Right.
speaking about your feelings. So I don't even know if it's as much ego as it is they just don't know how to express
It
it.
is the ego thing, the Desi man
Think so?
has.
No, but
Some-
again, the
sometimes,
whole
not
cycle
all
is
the time.
perpetuated. Yeah, I mean, I'm guilty of that too. I have 2 boys, and a lot of times if they're crying, it's like I was just thinking, I'm less supportive as compared to if I had seen a girl cry. So like, because in my mind also culturally, we are all a product of our culture. It's like they need to behave a certain way, or so even I'm guilty of that at times, and we perpetuate it too. So it's not just the men; it's like it's the whole culture we have. So quickly moving on to suicide precautions, if you can just take a look. So I always talk about gun safety. In our community, there's, as of right now, not that much of a big problem. I think in future it's going to be, because everybody's buying guns these days, right? In all communities, more women are buying guns. So I talk about it. I'm like, where do you keep the gun? Is it in a safe? Is the safe locked? Do you have a designated person that you can give the gun to? Do you keep the ammunition separately? Is the ammunition in a safe? I talk about all of that. Do you have a gun lock? So I discuss that step by step. Again, and these are more of the practical things. Like if somebody's that depressed, even if a doctor doesn't talk about it, the family members should be doing that anyway. Making sure they don't have access to sharp objects. This was somebody who's suicidal, right? So the medication is locked up. And you give them a pill box. Okay, like in the beginning when I release someone, I'm like, okay, you get a pill box. You do not have access to more than 3 days supply of your medication. Your mom or dad or your husband or wife or your kid, even the kids if they're more than 18, they can help you with this at least for the next few weeks, so you don't have the temptation to take an overdose. And then people tell me, oh, but they can just go and buy Tylenol and do something. The whole idea is to make it more difficult. Like, what's the whole point? Like, if you have a gun and a gun safe, ammunition separately, it will, if they want to get to it, it's going to take them more time, and they will have more time to process that and kind of think about, okay, should I get help? It will not be that impulsive. There's this National Suicide Prevention Helpline there. So again, if this would be for somebody who's having passive thoughts, it's not such an acute risk, then this is a good number to call. However, if somebody is having active thoughts, plan and intent, then the number to call is 911. They either come to the ER or better, just if it's a family member, the other person is not agreeing, just call 911 and start from there. The next one is just a brief plan. Again, because not too much can be done in one ER visit, right? So just making people think about a safety plan. And it should be tailor-made. It should be, because my idea of what is relaxing may be very different from what your idea of what is relaxing for you is, right? So just like finding out what do they like to do, and if they say I have no hobbies, like what did you enjoy in the past? What can you do? Like even it can be as simple as like going for a walk, even taking a shower. Even that can help. Like, can you do this, this, and this? So, or think about. Just like in therapy, they talk about like when somebody has the urge to cut, like can you put a rubber band around your wrist and can you just snap it? So just like, that's a safer alternative as compared to the poor coping skills that they have. But again, if it all persists, calling the helpline, and then, so I try to give the patients a plan in their head, like a stepwise approach, like you do this, this, and this. Because the idea is not to just take the thoughts away. What I tell them is what you do about the thoughts is important. It's going to be a process. It's not going to be a magic pill. It's not going to be a one-day thing. It's going to be a process which may take months. It may take years to get under control, but there are options there and many people get there. And then there's some resources at the bottom. I really like this website, Zero Suicide, because that has the helplines for different countries. Like for Australia, New Zealand, UK, so it has helplines for all of those countries. Now Matters Now, that's again a good website as a resource to learn more about it. And NAMI is National Alliance of Mentally Ill. It's an excellent website, and a lot of family members also use that just to get more information. So it has information about depression, bipolar disorder, what's happening, what's new. So, simple language to explain things to people.
I have a question about this National Suicide Prevention Lifeline phone number. If you are a relative of a person who is going through all this, can they also contact that? No.
What would be the point?
Just to know how to help them.
So if you are a relative, and so basically, let me put it this way. Relatives, friends can only intervene when it's an acute psychiatric emergency. So somebody's acutely suicidal, they're threatening someone or they're threatening themselves. That's when you call 911. The suicide prevention hotline is for people to call themselves. So that would be the difference.
Can you discuss a little bit about what CBT is, cognitive behavioral therapy? What you guys
Sure.
touch base on?
So I think when people think about therapy, they think about psychodynamic psychotherapy, and some people have this vision in their head, like people will be lying down on the couch and just talking about it. That's not what happens even in psychodynamic therapy now. Even that is more practical. But psychodynamic therapy would be like exploring what happened in your past, any past traumas, how do you work around it. Cognitive behavior therapy is more in the here and now. It doesn't focus too much on like, okay, what were your life stresses? Life stresses, yes, but what happened in the past? It focuses on like, okay, like for example, if somebody has a phobia, what can you do about it? Learning to think about it in a practical way. Like say if somebody has a phobia of getting on a freeway, so talking about, okay, thinking in percentages, what percentage chance is there that today you're going to have an accident? So, you know, just making them walk through it and coming about strategies, because it's a behavior extension in a way. When we do a thing too many times, we cannot be too anxious about it. So for example, if somebody has a germ phobia, forcing them, giving them exercises, like forcing them to, you don't wash your hands for 2 hours and you do this, which these days would be more tricky. So just that, so.
It's a practical way.
It's a practical way. Usually the sessions are 8 to 12 sessions, so it's short because most people cannot do therapy for too long these days. So it's more of a practical, in the present, like what can you work on? So just to give people some resources to improve their coping skills.
I have a question also. Can you tell me about neurofeedback? Does it help with depression? Is there any benefit of getting neurofeedback for patients of
It sounds
depression?
pretty fancy, but I'm not even exactly sure what they would be doing.
It's about what I heard. I heard from Women's Center that women came there with depression and with all kinds of issues. So they usually use this neurofeedback. It's that brain waves. You have some brain waves. So they show you some pictures on the laptop, and then you have wire on your head,
Okay.
and then they are seeing your waves, brain waves, and that kind of like a in a way they are trying to create more positive waves, brain waves, than the negative.
I mean, I would think that would help more in a lot of pain conditions, like chronic pain, and so you know when they have the severe pain, and that's when they can focus on, or if they use a coping strategy, okay, let's see if it's working right now. But in terms of, I mean, I wouldn't call that the main, like the main primary
primary
or
treatment,
whatever.
but
I wouldn't call it
like
it
a
can be a good
sideways. Because it does
augmented
not have any side
treatment.
effects. There is no like major side effects, or not. It does not even have any kind of like a any dangers like.
Right, but again, I
extras.
want to emphasize this, and especially I see that in let's say postpartum depression, or like when women are pregnant and they stop taking their antidepressants, but you need to have a discussion about what will happen with depression. Okay, you're talking about these potential side effects, and the chances of this happening is very low, versus like, you know, even things like mothers don't wash their hands that frequently, and the babies get diarrhea, and what's going to happen to that baby if the mother is that severely depressed. So you have to think about that too. And then decide what kind of treatment options you want. And like I mentioned, most of these medications have very few side effects. And of course, I'm not going to make a claim. I think only quacks do that and say that there's no side effect, right? That's what the problem is like.
I didn't mean to say that we do not need to use medicine, but I was just.
I mean, it sounds like a nice augmentation treatment.
And is it being used by a psychiatrist or no?
I've not used it.
No, not yet.
No.
Okay.
Any other questions?
How much time do we?